Okay. All right, am I good?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So during this time, I noticed that there was like a more radical change. But like not a lot of people really accepted it because of like everything that was going on, like the Social Democrats. They
Mhm.
were more of like, they thought of themselves as more like up on the hierarchy, I would say. Like they were socialites and like they thought they were more entitled, I guess.
Mhm.
Say in like England, which had like a lot to do with it because England kind of had this, which made like Americans want what England had, I would say. Like they persuaded it. Um, it was more of a social democracy than like a government, I would say. Like it really wasn't like it was more about social, not like making rules, is what. So like I guess like these women wanted to be more a part of that as opposed to, I think they wanted more respect. And that's why they wanted to be more in like the social aspect. But it was
Yeah.
kind of like pick and choose. Like they kind of were like very strict about who let in, but they also wanted like public education, health, sanitation, justice, labor laws. Like they wanted more realistic things than what was given to them in the past. Because like when we looked at those photos last week,
Hmm.
no such thing as child labor laws. So they were trying to like imply that for this social, like during the democracy, is what I've noticed. And they wanted to persuade this because they thought like to fix America. They knew there was like a lot of holes in this, and England was kind of already like there. So they kind
Hmm.
of wanted to like follow in England's footsteps because they knew what we were doing was not wrong. I mean, right, sorry, per se. Um, so they were trying to change this and like manifest, I guess, like these new changes in social society, but not a lot of people were okay with that because Americans really don't like change. I feel like Americans actually never really like change. So I think when something like this was trying to change, they were just kind of like not really about it, I would say.
Well, also we have to remember that this is the first time really where you get a sort of, when it comes to, it's first time in the 19th century anyway, where you get a sort of um, idea that, I mean, it's the first time, it's a major time, the idea that European reforms have gone too far. European reformers are going too far. European reformers, remember, this is now in the aftermath. This is not 1820, 1830, when you have religious reformers and temperance reformers in 1840s and stuff. In the aftermath, by American standards, by Americans' view, the aftermath of the Civil War, after the Civil War, Americans are already starting to realize European reformers are starting to become more radical. So, people are reading Marx, people are reading Engels, the Fabians, as Flanagan rightly points out, are becoming very, very popular in Britain. And it seems what I want to argue is that this is kind of the time when there's an anti-European backlash against European ideas of reform are seen as you say, un-American and should be avoided. And so that's it's very, very hard for these reformers to inculcate those ideas here, because as so many of those reforms seem to be so much stronger and so much more sweeping than than previous American reforms. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt your flow there.
No, you're good. I was just sorry if I didn't put it like, I don't
No,
know.
it's just that I sometimes don't think Flanagan talks about that enough. That there is a sort of nativism in the reaction to European reforms that is, well, frankly, problematic. The idea that we can't because when European reform ideas come over, people look at 1848 in Europe and said, well, the entire continent tears itself apart in 1848. We don't want that. And then when
Yeah.
our entire continent tore itself apart in the Civil War, we don't want that. That's what that leads to. So certain reform is important and okay, but pushing it we need an Americanized version of it rather than a European version of it.
Yeah, and I think they were trying to like copy too much of it, and I think that's why Americans didn't really like it, because they wanted like their own, because America likes their own ideas, I feel like. So, but they were trying, because they, in a perfect world, it could have worked. You know what I mean? Like it would work. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, but also, I mean, you're absolutely right. But there are these American versions of stuff that are very American. I mean, Eugene Debs and the Industrial Workers of the World, they're not talking about Eugene Debs, partly because of strategic reasons and PR reasons, or whatever you want to call them, isn't going around saying we need to follow Marx and Engels in lockstep. There's an American version of this. Is an American type of social justice that we want, and if it can't be done through the traditional political parties, then it's very American to start a new party or a new labor union or a new labor movement. What else? What about suffrage? This seems to me is the key here, and one of the reasons I asked this question is because suffrage, female suffrage, is both in kind and in form and in sort of approach is so similar to many other types of reforms. It's almost like a case study of reform movements in this period. The specific question I ask in that is how did the social politics idea manifest itself in women's suffrage in the election of 1912?
Sorry, I was looking over. I should have highlight. I need to learn how to highlight things. I honestly can't find it. I'm sorry. Oh. So basically, male progressives started supporting this at this time, which was huge, because before they were kind of like divided between women and men, but they were kind of rejected too in like a way. But females also rejected the idea of like the equal rights too. Like they really didn't want it, in a weird sense, is what I got from this. And,
yeah, a lot of them did. Yeah.
Like they didn't really want it, but they wanted women to vote, which was, but like they wanted like the middle class, because before they really, like, not everyone could vote, and kind of like the higher class was allowed to vote compared to like middle class and low class. So it got extended toward that, and like there was more equality leagues in the country during this time, and like the Chicago Women's Club, the Political Equality League, they started kind of like to form this suffrage.
Sorry.
No, you're fine. They wanted to promote this social politics into it to become a whole, but like I said, not a lot of women, they were against it. So it was kind of like, what is the right thing to do at this point if you have some women like rejecting it and some women who are for it? And then there's also like men backing up. So like during this, like the suffrage was kind of, there was like a lot of loose ends, I guess you could say.
But notice, for instance, that there's the idea that suffrage brought about through legislation is one way to cure social evils. I mean, on 133, the famous Colorado Equal Suffrage Association says, um, charity can never do it. Only right laws, rightly executed, can reform social conditions. In other words, this is a thing that needs to be done politically / governmentally, rather than, the improving women's lives through better, I don't know, church or voluntary organizations, having, I don't know, better schools or whatever, that only goes certain ways. That only right laws eventually can secure the kind of rights that we secure the kind of social conditions that we need. This is ultimately, this is all progressives effectively want their version of progressivism to be reflected in law eventually. That Hull House, the suffrage movement, the temperance movements, all these things want to, they're doing their own thing. They're doing their own thing in their own way to begin with, because they can't get local or national governments to implement these things. But what they want ultimately is for there to be laws to back these up. Now, they happen to think they have different ideas about what's the most important thing to attack first, but they actually want laws. They don't necessarily want constitutional amendments, but they definitely want laws. What else? What about the election of 1912?
So during this time, there was like some losing campaigns, and Roosevelt actually was back, which I thought was interesting for the Republicans, progressive Republicans.
Yeah.
And during that, they were also fighting the battles in like Africa. Like there was like stuff going on in Africa, and they also went to they formed the National Progressive Republican League, which actually came to the convention of that time. And Roosevelt wanted their support, but a lot of people, again, underestimated Roosevelt. Like they thought that he couldn't do it, but jokes on them, because he came back. So I thought that was really interesting that Roosevelt kept coming back. I mean, he really didn't seem like a person to give up during this time. So he came back, and there was a lot of fights during the progressives. And sorry, it's like it's hard to like do all this by myself. I'm sorry. There's like,
No, I understand. Remember, one thing we have to start with remembering is that there are progressives in both parties.
yeah,
Okay. And that Teddy Roosevelt especially wants to make sure that he's progressive enough not only to keep the progressive Republicans in the Republican Party voting for him as a Republican, but enough to also make any progressive Democrats who are sitting on the fence between the two parties vote for him. So there's the progressive party needs all progressives to vote for him, in addition to need to draw away I shouldn't say Teddy Roosevelt as Republican. Teddy Roosevelt as this new progressive party need to draw away progressives from the Republicans and progressives from the Democrats.
and also during this time, I noticed that this actually helped endorse women's suffrage. Like, like this actually started having to do with that, with like the campaigns and stuff during the election, which I thought was very interesting, because this had like a lot to do with it, which was like a big play on this election with the women.
Right. Okay. Now notice that this doesn't, I mean, this doesn't really work. Wilson is stealing enough progressive ideas for the Democrats. Taft is stealing enough trust busting ideas for the Republicans. Roosevelt can't carve a sufficiently identifiable progressive identity with a capital P in order to make the Progressive Party fly. And of course, Eugene Debs is just out on the side. So the election being kind of split four ways. Well, it's not, 1912 is a four-way race, but really it's a three-way race. Why was I taking it? Why was I taking it that way? Oh, so what I'm trying to say is that as Flanagan argues, those who believe in the new social politics could still stay with their traditional political party and see within that party the party's degree of adherence to progressive ideas. So I think this is one of the reasons why the Progressive Party just isn't enough to make people jump ship from the other parties.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Let's move now. So that you can scurry off to the dentist, let's move to question one. So this is Katie and Vince, right?
Except Katie read Fink, so it's really just.
Oh, all right. Sorry.
Think is Thursday though, right?
Right.
Okay.
Is anyone else besides Vince here for number one?
I am, but I read Fink by accident. So.
Oh, okay. Vince, you feel like shouldering this burden? Do you want to be part of this corrupt bargain that we've come up with today?
I can give it my best shot.
Okay, good man. Good man. Sorry.
So the corrupt bargain was kind of the difference between American infrastructure and European infrastructure, because at the time Europe was making all of their infrastructure like public works, like controlled by the municipal, paid for by the city. It wasn't privatized, or as the book said, franchised. And this created a problem in America at the time, because when this is around the time when all of the cities are being built and they're adding all these new features like electric lights, streetway cars. There was something else in there that they were adding to. Oh, public housing or free housing. And America's solution at the beginning of this was to privatize all this, make all of these companies, let all these people build their own companies and provide these services to the city. This ended up being a terrible idea, because each person that bought a little chunk of whatever utility or housing they controlled was not compatible with anyone else who was either in the same business or the same industry. And people saw this as a problem eventually, even after all these private companies consolidated into one. Like there'd be one main utility company, one main housing company, one main company for the streetcars, and to create a lot of political corruptness as they tried to move towards having these controlled by the city. And let's see what else I got in here. Basically, the corruptness came from being able to bargain these utilities between like political favors or monetary favors or anything like that. And progressives at the time saw this as a problem. One of the leading solutions was the where was it? It was the Wisconsin idea, actually, where progressives tried to basically reform voting laws, reform. What else they want? Sorry, I lost my page here.
Yeah, Wisconsin is sort of the shining example on a hill of reform states.
Yeah, they wanted to reform it and basically get all of these utilities into the hands of public hands. Becomes the city's responsibility to pay for all these services.
Um, did the I'm sorry, just read. Did the various solutions proposed by different states, different political groups, and labor movements help bring about solutions, or they just contribute to the corrupt bargain?
Um, at the beginning, it pretty much just contributed to the problem. There wasn't really any good idea, one idea at the time that was generally accepted. There was a lot of involvement from different types of groups. Like I already mentioned, Wisconsin was a pretty progressive state at the time, so
Mhm.
they were kind of leading the way. But other groups got involved, like women, national women leagues got involved to propose political reform ideas. The main issue that I saw to it were labor groups. The way I understood it was that they organized labor groups were not a fan of any sort of any more political or government control over any sort of aspect of their life, including public infrastructure.
Mhm.
Um, although by the end of the 20s, it was pretty much to the point where reform had done enough to provide people with this public infrastructure without it being privatized or bargainized or monopolized or anything like that. So I would say that these solutions did end up um, stopping the corrupt bargain.
Okay, good. That's a really good answer. Does any of this remind you of the sort of and I mean all of you generally, and remind you of what the Democratic Party now seems to be suffering through, which is uh, the Democratic Party wants reform of various kinds, but that it's the various kinds that is the problem. There's the Mansion Cinema group on the sort of conservative Democratic side. There's the Biden group in the middle. There's the Sanders AOC group on the left. It almost seems to be the case that this is something that plagues reform movements all the time, is a not necessarily a lack of agreement, but a lack of agreement on scope and methods. That what you're seeing here for reformers eventually either giving into the corrupt bargain or pushing for their version and ultimately failing is a lot of what we see now. This is just talking off the top of your head time.
I saw it as, I think I would agree with that. One of the things that I thought could have sped up um, political reform at this time would have been a centralization of like having one main goal for everyone to rally around, rather than everyone having basically like a kind of a similar idea, but still having different motives or different outcomes that they wanted at the end, anything like that.
This is interesting because my other class, my morning class and my early class and the afternoon class is just a survey of American history, the start of American history. We're talking about the reform period in the 1820s to 1840s, 50s. And one of the arguments that historians make is that the only reform movements that actually seem to work are the ones that concentrate on a specific issue, and that the idea of reform generally, reform as a broad-based reform, collapses of its own weight. The sharks come in from the various sides, and the Mansion Cinema shark doesn't like this part of a bill, so it eats away at the AOC part doesn't like this part of the bill, so the shark doesn't like this part of the bill, so it eats away at it and falls of its own weight. And that's why, among other things, that I argue that the temperance movement of the old period, not our period, is one of the few things that actually survives. So it seems to be a condition, seems to be a continuing condition for reformers and reform movements. Okay, good. What about, let's see, this is, now we'll get, sorry. Oh, Lord. The question 2 here, how difficult was it to reform the state during these progressive years? Jeanette, is that you?
Yeah. So what I got from this chapter, especially when it came to progressive groups and reform, was that there was a lot of compromise that fell flat or like even lost the points that progressivism had begin with, especially like Jane Addams
Yeah.
type of progressivism. So like when Roosevelt then became president, I think there was a hope that there would be some reform, but it sort of twisted into something different, especially when it comes to then progressive citizenship, where the idea was to help immigrants, but then it eventually led to this almost anti-immigrant sentiment, because the whole idea was that they would assimilate and become American rather than holding on to any of their culture, which gives this idea that they were lesser to begin with because they weren't American. So, which is like something that Lodge didn't even try to deny, but
Yeah.
Roosevelt was kind of in the middle of.
Yeah. Okay, good. And your question was sort of the hardest one, the longest one.
Yeah.
What about this idea of progressive citizenship? How do political parties, the presidency, pressure groups help to define it?
Didn't they sort of put in legislation, like Roosevelt ended up changing I can't think of the word, the test you have to take to become a citizen, the
Civil
natural-
service, yeah.
He ended up changing that, so that led to continuing to bolster this citizen, this like this sort of anti-immigrant idea. That led to also, what happened to American Indians, where they tried to assimilate them into society. Like there was different arguments for what they would do with them, but that was the one that won. Yeah, that's kind of what I got out of it.
Okay. Yeah, I often consider these things in this question specifically, and this sort of goes along with what Ben was saying, Vince was saying, and what in fact what we're talking about this morning is that that if you want to talk about the final part of that question, the dimensions of the new regulatory state were constantly being I don't know, redefined or I should say restricted. None of these progressives get what they ultimately want in total out of the progressive state, and I just wonder why it just continues to be this problem. In other words, in order to reach the sort of regulatory state that progressives want, is it simply the fact that progressives want too many different things, they can't agree on on everything, and so they're never going to get the dimensions of the regulatory state that they want.
Yeah, I think it was just way too spread out. Like there was bills and acts put in place, but no one centralized on them enough. So like the Clayton Antitrust Act, like one half of it worked, but the other half of it didn't, especially when it came to like the competition and the trust busting.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. There's some things that are remarkably successful and then become a sort of just accepted part of American life. No one argues for monopolies anymore. I mean, I don't know, maybe crazy people do, but everyone agrees with trust busting, and everyone agrees that even as laissez-faire as we might want the economy to be, there has to be at the very minimum there has to be this trust busting aspect of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, what else? Let's all of you in this sort of these chapters. What's the sense that you got about the dynamism of what's going on in this period? Is it? I mean, this is one of the reasons why it's one of the most studied periods in American history. It just seems to be constantly churning itself. It's constantly churning the types of reform desires, the types of reform organizations, the types of reform outcomes, if you will, is just constant. It's almost as if the country never gets a chance to rest. And before I say that, before I finish that thought, in some ways, the only way, well, in some instances, the only way in which reformers can get what they really want is to concentrate on the local. So California is able to get the kind of reforms it wants because it makes them California state reforms. Wisconsin is able to get the kinds of reforms it wants because they make Wisconsin state reforms. But as soon as Bob LaFollette goes off to Washington and tries to take it to a broader level, it never goes anywhere. I'm sorry, there's a question in there somewhere, and I'm not phrasing it properly, but it just seems to me very interesting that states that are big and diverse and have all kinds of different interests do seem to agree to things on their own level, but then when it comes to the national level, they fail. Again, that's a general question to throw out to all of you.
I think it's just because every issue looks different for every state. Like even when you go into the idea, which I feel like is talked a lot now about like leftists, is poverty. But rural poverty looks a lot different than urban poverty. And the ways to beat both of those are very different. So it's almost like it can only happen in a local area.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So I know I just said, yeah.
I'm sorry. No, I was gonna say, I totally agree, because like where I grew up in North Carolina, there are things that can be done where I grew up that would not be applicable to the other end of the state. Rules and regulations that are set up and function even now for things as simple as like farming, for instance. There are very certain regulations that work on the eastern half of the state that do not functionally work in the Appalachian range for various reasons.
Well, the whole farming situation is fundamentally different, really.
Exactly. I mean, and so even when you look at it like that, I've lived all over the country, and you really can't say that there's a rule that blanketly across the country is done, even if it is a law that is in place. Like I was talking about this in a different history class, but speed limits is such an interesting concept that like each state fundamentally responds to that differently. And you would think that that's something that everyone could agree on. And there are places like Wyoming that there are still no speed limits when you get out of Cheyenne.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's interesting to look at it in this time period, because it is hard to place a rule and reforms for one place that make no sense contextually somewhere else.
Or at the very least that meet with such opposition in other places. So for instance, I remember this is way before you were born, but during the oil crisis in the 70s, when there's the national speed limit imposed at 55, people went nuts. Some places it wasn't that much of a change, but it was almost as if you were being asked to be part of Stalinistic Russia. Some the strength. I mean, some of my relatives used to just go berserk over these people who never traveled interstate at all, hardly at all. Where this was a fundamental American freedom or whatever. So yes, that's very interesting. And sometimes I wonder whether, in fact, I don't wonder. I know. We just by not tradition, but just by sort of inertia or whatever, our states were created in ways that didn't necessarily make geographic sense. North Carolina, upcountry North Carolina, and low country North Carolina is a very obvious case, right? But that's the way it developed, and it partly developed because North Carolina wanted to make sure it had enough power in Congress against Virginia to its north. So it had to be, it was always traditionally extended as far west as it did, but it had to be extended all the way out to what eventually becomes the Tennessee border. But as you say, you have two very different cultures there.
And it's an interesting thing. And I know that probably sounds crazy to compare it to something like speed limits or farming things, but it's hard sometimes to place these grand reforms, these big ideas, into things that are easy for us to digest, the things that are, history is always the familiar versus the strange.
Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes it's hard to think of these reforms. There was a time in my mother's life where she couldn't get a bank because she was a woman, without her dad's permission. And so these reforms rather have been growing and evolving, since this time. And it's interesting to see how, when you look back, the things that seemed incredibly shifting then still are in many ways shifting today. There's a lot of the same stuff that really never got resolved in any solid way.
Oh, sure. Or continues to be tinkered with. Desegregation, in many ways worked, but then there are all sorts of resegregation efforts that work that get implemented at the local level through kind of backdoor channels. And so, it is a very, very interesting problem, especially in a country where state identity has been so powerful from the very, 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 very beginning. I mean, Rhode Island, for instance, just to talk about my early, I mean, they're just permanently pissed off in the colonial period, in the Revolution. They don't want to be part of everything. They want to do everything their own way, and they're tiny, right? And so, but it matters. So Rhode Island is not only created its own state, but in order to get anything done, you have to continually compromise with all the different states, and it's very difficult to have a uniform agreement on almost anything. Okay, well, let's get ready for Fink on Thursday, and now that I know to pin discussions, the most pressing discussion at the top of the discussion thing on Canvas, I think that will help people understand what they need to do. Okay, any questions? Well, start looking for all your paper grades tonight, because they're all getting done. Okay. You there?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
All right. So we'll talk to you on Thursday.
Have a good day.
Yep, you too.